The paper will be discussed by Andrés Fernández. Andrés is the manager of economic studies of the Central Bank of Chile since April 2019. Previously, he worked as a senior researcher in the research department of the Inter-American Development Bank, an institution he joined in 2012. He is the author of numerous publications in specialized journals in economics and finance, and chapters in books of the IDB and Bank of the Republic of Colombia. He holds a PhD in economics from Rutgers University. Andrés, you have 15 minutes.
Okay, you hear me? Thank you so much. Let me first join Governor Marcel and Elias in welcoming you all here to Santiago for those external invited people. And also it's a pleasure to host you here in this conference. I see many mentors and even some professors of my earlier years. Thank you to the book editors, to Ricardo, Ernesto, and Diego for inviting me to discuss this very nice paper. I had a lot of fun reading it and I learned quite a bit. I'm gonna center my discussion around 2 points. One, first, I'd like to start by highlighting some of the key elements that I think the paper has, as well as the key takeaways that, at least on my side, I took home after reading the paper, and then I'll do some comments. So what are the key ingredients in this recipe? I'd say there are 3. First, a Galli-Monticelli type of setup, combined with the possibility of having partial default, sovereign default, and then the type of coordination problem between monetary and fiscal that Francesco has developed in some of his earlier work. Now, households will have a complete set of array of financial products, so there will be complete markets on the side of households, but however, governments, or the government, because it can partially default on its debt, they're gonna face risky bonds, or investors are going to face risky bonds when they purchase this debt. What is going to be central in the story of Francesco is this Markov switching process of government spending, which I'm going to highlight next. So the key gist of the paper can be seen through a handful of equations. Besides a typical IS and Phillips curve, you have the monetary policy rule, where you can have passive or active monetary policy in the sense of Taylor, say, by the monetary authority reacting more or less to inflation. If it reacts more than 1-to-1 to inflation, you have an active monetary policy in the sense of Taylor. Now, what is essential in the story is the government budget constraint. So the government budget constraint, which you have in front of you, first, let me highlight this Markov switching process, which is government spending, that for some exogenous reason, the government is spending low, and then it jumps to a higher level. And then, really, all the problem or all the action comes from what are taxes going to do with this increasing spending that then boosts debt. So are taxes going to increase pari passu with the increasing debt, or are they not? If they don't increase as much, or not as much as one would like to, then this coefficient in the consolidated budget constraints, once you consolidate these 2 equations, then this coefficient that comes straight from this process, this law of motion for taxes, is not going to be enough as to compensate this other term. You're going to have a coefficient greater than 1, and hence debt is going to explode, right? It's going to have an explosive path, and we don't like particular explosive paths in models in economics because they're not easy to solve. That's why we kind of like put them aside. So, okay, so that's the core, I guess, or what generates actions in this model. What are the key takeaways? I'd say there are two key takeaways, at least from my side. First, and Francesco stressed that, what is really nice is that these explosive dynamics that we generally tend to put under the rug because we basically don't know how to solve models with them, you can have them in the solution. And why you can have, at least temporarily, you can have an equilibrium that is stable throughout the entire sequence of years that you simulate this model, in which some of those years will feature these explosive dynamics. So that is particularly handy when you want to talk about crisis. Why does this happen? Well, it happens because of the possibility of recurrent changes in this policy mix. You might be in a explosive path, but agents understand that this might be just transitory, so they might react by changing their beliefs. Technically, what happens, or what allows Francesco to do this, is because he cast the solution of his model in a Markov switching VAR solution that agents understand. So you understand that if government spending exogenous jumps, and that triggers a sort of like a crisis type of dynamics, well, things might change later on, and you might go back to an equilibrium that is stable. So basically that allows you to jump from some of these quadrants in the matrix that Francesco elaborated on. And the second takeaway from this model that I liked is well, and it's related to the first takeaway, is that you can have changes in expectations that divorce inflation from fundamentals, and you have these, what economists sometimes call, this self-fulfilling crisis, a la Guillermo Calvo or Cole Kehoe, except with a nice ingredient that Francesco puts into the mixture, the possibility of talking about monetary policy. Okay, so that's the gist of the paper and my takeaway. So what are going to be my comments? I'm going to stress three things. First, I'm going to raise some skepticism that this framework can be indeed used to think about the Latin American history or macroeconomic history of the last half century. I'm going to raise some skepticism because I'm going to compare it to what I think is more intuitive, which is a plain, simple story of good old fiscal dominance. The second comment is going to refer to the theory itself, and I'm going to highlight some of the questions that I ended up in my mind after reading the paper, which are going to lead me to call this theory, even though it's a nice theory, a partial theory. And even a counterfactual theory once you take it to the data. And hence I'm going to argue that if you go, and in the end, I'm going to argue that the presence of complete markets on the house of households make it somewhat of an unrealistic theory. So lack of coordination or just plain old good fiscal dominance. So as you saw, Francesco took his model to Chilean data, and as if the coordination problem that he has in the model could be useful for understanding some of Chilean history. I do understand where Francesco is coming from with this. In earlier work, he has used this coordination problem for the Volcker-Reagan episodes of the 80s and the broader history of the US. Now, if you take a step back, it's kind of hard to think of this coordination problem for a period where most of it was we lived under no central bank independence, right? So imagine the situation of a not an independent central bank trying to be active on monetary policy while the government is having an explosionary path of debt. I don't think that central bank would last much. That central banker would last much time in its job, because it's going to be facing the government on and on. So I guess a litmus test to this theory is to try to identify cases where you had active policies, not only on the fiscal side, but also on the monetary side. And even better if such an identification could be done by taking the model to the data. I'm not going to pretend to be a scholar on Chilean macro history. I do know one or two things about monetary history in Colombia. I wrote a paper for a volume that was edited about a decade ago, where we took a look at the whole monetary history of Colombia throughout the 20th century. If I'm forced to summarize that work in a sentence through the lens of these ideas, I would say this. Whenever the fiscal policies were okay, were sound, then monetary policy could do its job. Whenever fiscal policy did not do its job, then the monetary policy could not do anything about that. There was nothing about coordination in that story. Now, if you want to take it even more broader to more countries in Latin America, this is a quote from the book that is forthcoming by Juan Panicolini and authors, where they review the inflationary episodes of 10 countries in Latin America, and they conclude that a common pattern was the lack of fiscal discipline in those cases. Nothing related to coordination. Okay, so let me move on to the second comment on the partial theory of crisis. So again, it's a very elegant and nicely crafted theory, but you start towards the end of the paper, or through the middle, you start wondering about the two exogenous drivers in the story. Public spending and taxes on one side and beliefs on the other. On beliefs, the question that I'm left with is, how are they formed? Is there some sort of Bayesian updating that is taking place in the background? So Francesco didn't elaborate, but this is the matrices that give the probabilities of jumping, for example, from an exchange rate regime to a crisis. Where do these probabilities come from? How agents believe in those probabilities? Do they revise their beliefs according to some Bayesian criteria? I know economists, we're pretty bad in modeling beliefs. We don't have a good story for that, so I'm not going to give Francesco a hard time on that. Where I do have a bigger problem is on the process for public spending and the Markov switching process that drives it. So what are the economics behind such a process? What triggers a change in regime? So I was talking about you're in a low state and then you suddenly jump out of the blue. What are the economics behind this? What triggers this increase? And more importantly, are these processes, not only of spending but of taxes, validating the data? I would have liked to see the process for both government spending and taxes be estimated through a Markov switching model, and then fed that onto the model. Actually, I'm going to argue that such processes for government spending and taxes can be actually counterfactual. So remember, what is going on here is that the government spending boosts from period 3 onwards, and output starts to decrease. That's what triggers a crisis. This is exactly counterfactual. This is a picture taken from an ongoing work with Charlie Vega and some other co-authors, where we update some of Charlie's estimates of the co-movement between government spending in non-OECD countries in yellow and output. What you systematically see in these countries, the yellow ones, the dark ones are the OECD countries, is that government actually moves in tandem with output. And this is where crisis occurs, the type of crisis that Francesco is thinking about. By the way, Chile is somewhere around here. This is a long, this is a statistic computing from the 1970s. Taxes behave in a pretty similar way. So let me now move to the third and final comment. I know my time is out, so I'll be very quick. So remember, a feature of the model is to have complete markets, right, on the side of the households, living together with risky debt, risky public debt, but there's no connection between the two. That is a little bit hard to swallow, right? That financial markets would deliver a whole sophisticated array of state contingent assets to households, but on the other hand, they wouldn't internalize the fact that these houses are living with a government that can default. Francesco seems to be aware of this, at least in the concluding remarks. He says that including complete or getting rid of complete markets is something that he would like to do later on. In fact, I'm going to be arguing that the market incompleteness on the size of households can be the root of the problem for the fiscal policy. I'm going to make that case with one model that fits in one slide. And it's a small open economy model, just like Francesco did. It's going to be a static model. Output can be high or low with a probability P and minus P. Preferences are going to be separable in consumption and government spending. There I'm deviating from Francesco's framework because I'm having government having a purpose in this model. In his model is just wasted resources. And then you're going to have the case of incomplete markets, which I'm going to take to the extreme, assuming financial autarky, and the case of complete markets. You have the government or the consolidated budget constraints. You can, in a one page of algebra, you can get to these two conclusions. One is that under fiscal Ramsey policy in this setup, government spending is going to be acyclical under complete markets, but it's going to be pro-cyclical in incomplete markets. So incomplete markets on the side of households is going to lead you to having a pro-cyclical fiscal policy, and that's going to be the seed for the future crisis. You can reach the same conclusion for taxes with a little bit of assumption on the parametrization. So the point here is it's essential for me to that a model of for fiscal crisis to have some sort of financial frictions also on the side of houses. I think that's a realistic element to have and a valid one to think about fiscal policy in these countries. So let me conclude by saying that this is a very, very nice paper, an elegant theory on crisis. It features both explosive dynamics, which we like, together with expectation-driven crisis, which we also kind of like. I think more work needs to be done in order to convince us that this is really a model that we can use for rationalizing the previous 50 years of macroeconomic history in emerging markets, and Chile in particular. A good avenue would be to take this model to the data in a more formal way. And if you can do it with incomplete markets on the household side as well, that would be even better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrés, very much.